Hello everyone, this is Jaron from MarineAndReef.com, and today we're going to do a video all about pH on our budget reef tank build series. We're going to go over what is pH, why do we care about it, how do you measure pH, and finally, how do you fix pH problems, whether your pH is too high or too low. So without further ado, let's go over what is pH and why do we care about it in the first place. Well, pH, quite simply, is the ratio of acid to base inside your aquarium, and it's measured on a scale from 0 being as acidic as possible to 14 being as basic as possible. Now, to explain this a little bit more, what acidic means in chemistry is basically adds hydrogen or H+ ions. I know you chemists listening are going to scowl and say that's not exactly what it means. Bear with us for now. And what basic means is adding hydroxide or OH ions. So you can imagine that inside the water there is some hydrogen ions and some hydroxide ions, and based on the balance or ratio of these two different ions in the water, the pH value is going to change from very acidic to very basic. 7 is neutral in the middle, 0 is as acidic as possible, and 14 is as basic as possible. Now, why in the world do we care about any of this? Well, quite simply, there's a few reasons. First off, the animals inside of our aquarium, whether it's the corals or fish, or if you have a freshwater aquarium, the plants, have lived their entire life at a very specific pH. And if you take them from that pH that they're used to and you put them in a different pH, it can cause immediate stress and you can experience losses very, very quick. So anything else, your fish are just very used to a certain pH, so having one that's very different than that is in and of itself problematic. Beyond that, there's a couple things that pH does. If your pH is extremely high, it can cause precipitation of certain elements. Basically, certain things will not be able to dissolve in the water, which can be a problem. And if your pH is particularly low, it can actually start to melt some things in your aquarium, including the aragonite gravel, the rocks, and ultimately the coral skeletons themselves, which are made of that aragonite material. So there's some very far extremes on that end. And finally, and probably most importantly for reef aquariums, the corals inside of our reef aquarium have a calcium-based skeleton. And in order for them to take the minerals out of that water and calcify them and turn them into new skeleton, it's much easier for them to do that if the pH is relatively high. If the pH is low, they have to work harder at a higher metabolic cost to do that. And this means that at subdued pHs in saltwater aquariums, coral growth rates can be dramatically lower, and at elevated pHs or proper pH levels, corals can grow far faster. And this can be the difference between your tank being filled with corals in a year or 4 years. It can literally be 2 to 3 times the growth rate in many cases. And because of this, it can make a very big difference if your pH is correct. So why is it that we have not talked about pH so far? We had 2 different videos in this series, one about basic tests when you're starting out, one about more advanced tests in the long run, and we didn't talk about pH. Well, it's because generally in most aquariums, your pH is just going to be fine. And if this is a beginner series for a budget reef tank, most people really shouldn't be stressing about it that much. But that being said, it is something that almost everybody is going to ask about, almost everybody's going to be curious about, and it can make a big difference as far as how fast your corals grow. So we're going to show you guys how we measure the pH next, showing off the new Marine and Reef pH tester, and then finally tell you guys what do you do if the pH values are off inside your aquarium. So now that you guys know why it's so important to measure pH inside your aquarium, we're going to go over how do you measure pH. Well, there's a wide variety of ways you can measure the pH inside your aquarium. First off, you're going to get what I'm going to call colorimetric tests. This could be a strip that changes color when you put it in the water. It could be a vial that you add drops to that then changes color. And this is probably the most common way of measuring pH inside the aquarium. And it does work, but it's one of those things where if you're colorblind like me, you may find yourself staring at a color chart squinting really hard. But ultimately, it does do the job, and it's probably the most affordable way for most people to measure pH. Next is going to be some kind of pH monitor. This is essentially a probe that sits inside of your aquarium and then gives you a constant readout of the pH. This is a very advanced solution, and what it's going to give you is a full trend of the pH throughout the day. So when we go to measuring pH, one thing to note is that most people's pH is going to change significantly throughout the day based upon the photosynthesis happening inside the aquarium. And the reason for this is that one of the most common things that affects pH in aquariums is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is an input into photosynthesis. So once the lights on your tank turn on, the corals that photosynthesize and any algae or plants that are photosynthesizing in the aquarium suck the carbon dioxide down, and carbon dioxide functions as an acid. So at night, when nothing's sucking the carbon dioxide out, the pH goes down. And during the day, as the photosynthetic animals do their thing, carbon dioxide levels go down, and therefore the ratio of the pH in the aquarium goes up. So you are going to see an up and down of pH every single day in a normal aquarium, and these leave-in probes are a great way of measuring it. The third way to measure pH is with an electronic tester, and today we're going to show you guys the Marine and Reef pH tester. The nice thing about these is they are more expensive than simply buying a test kit, but they last a long time, and in the long run, if you regularly test pH, they can wind up being cheaper because the calibration solution you need is generally cheaper than replacement reagents with colorimetric tests, and they're going to give you a nice digital readout that's very, very easy to read and understand, even if you're a little bit colorblind like me. So without further ado, we're going to open up this pH tester, show you guys what's included in the box. We're going to show you guys how to calibrate it, and then we're going to talk about what do you do once you got those test results. So as we lay out our pH tester and open it up, you're going to see there's a few things included. You're going to get 3 calibration packets. You're going to get your meter itself, and you're going to get a quick instruction manual. Now, the first step when using any kind of pH meter is to calibrate that meter. Essentially what we're doing is we're telling the computer inside the meter, this is what a pH of 10 reads like, this is what a pH of 4 reads like, this is what a pH of 7 reads like. And the general rule when calibrating is you should use a 2-point calibration, so you should use 2 packets, and you want to use the packets that are surrounding the value you plan to be testing. So in other words, in a saltwater aquarium, we expect the pH to be 7.8 to 8.4. That's generally the acceptable range. So when we're picking which packets to calibrate, we'd want the pH 10 as above that range and the pH 7 as below that range. These are above and below the range we anticipate measuring. We would use the pH 4 if we had an acidic freshwater aquarium, or if we were trying to measure, say, the pH coming out of a calcium reactor that often has very low pH. But for now, we're not going to use that. Now, these packets inside of the packaging are a powder that you dissolve in water. And it even says so on the package. It says 250 ml solution powder. So what we do with these is we're going to open them, dissolve them in 250 milliliters of purified water, and then we'll have a solution to calibrate with. Now, these are really nice because they can fit in the really tiny packaging, but we're going to show you guys that in the long run, most people are going to use a ready-to-use solution like this one from Milwaukee. These are very affordable. They do take up a bit more space, so that's why they're not packaged inside with a pH pen. But in the long run, most people use these ready-to-use guys. So we're going to use a 10 and a 7 to show you guys how to use the one that's included, and then how you'd use the ready-to-use guys moving forward. So for our first step, we're going to show you guys how you make a solution of pH calibration solution with the included powder packets. Inside of this little measuring cup here, we have 250 mils of water, which is exactly what it says on the packet. And we're simply going to open it up, pour the powder into the water. We'll use our highly fancy spoon to stir it until it's all dissolved. So we won't make you guys watch this, but you'll come back once everything's dissolved in. Right, so there it is. And you can see that basically the small variations we're getting are by the second decimal place, so they're really close. And this is calibrated. It's reading really close to 7, which is what we want. There's always going to be some variance as you swirl it around and whatnot. So now we're going to show you guys how you do the same thing with one of the pre-mixed packets, which is what you guys will do in the long run. All right, so after we pulled our pH pen out of the solution, I just got it as dry as possible with our little cleaning towel here. And these ready-to-use solutions are pretty straightforward. Basically, you can open them with a pair of scissors, and then they are ready to use. So we're going to once again hold down that calibration button. I'll show you guys here until we get close to 10 this time. Oop, so we can get to 10. There we go, 10. Then we're going to put our pen in the solution. Let it keep beeping. And it just did it. So we're calibrated at 10 and at 7, which is above and below where we plan to read. So now that our meter is calibrated, we're going to go ahead and use it to measure the pH of the aquarium water. So I'm just going to turn it on again, pull off the cover, and put it into the water. I like to put it in a place of high flow, just so that water is blowing over the edge, so you're getting fresh water. And it's normal to see some variation. So it did kind of vary up and down a little bit at first, but now it's settling down. And we are seeing about 8.26, so we get 8.2 pH in there. That's actually a really good value. So generally for reef aquariums, anywhere between 7.8 and 8.5 is acceptable. Things shouldn't be having any trouble. And I've seen some reef aquariums at 7.6, 7.7 that look totally beautiful. But generally the higher this number is, the easier your corals are going to have at calcification, which means they're going to be able to grow faster, which is a good thing. So a few things to note now that we've got our pH measurement is that with a pH pen like this, you are only getting a momentary pH measurement. In other words, we know what the pH of this water is right now. But as we mentioned earlier, the pH goes up and down throughout the day. So one problem many people have is if I measure the pH now and then say after the lights go out this evening, it's going to be lower when the lights go out than it is now. And that doesn't mean that our meter is inaccurate. It means that the pH in the water has changed because the animals are no longer photosynthesizing. So if you are trying to get a graph or an idea of the trend in your pH, you really want to measure that pH at the same time each day. So you should be comparing what the pH in your aquarium was like at 10 o'clock today versus tomorrow versus the next day to see if it's trending up or down. Cool. So now that we've gone over what is pH, why it matters, and how you test it in your aquarium, there's the obvious question of what do I do if the pH is off? And part of the reason why we put off talking about pH till this late inside our build series is in most cases, you shouldn't do anything. And that's because a lot of the methods of correcting the pH in your aquarium are rather advanced methods. And in this budget series, we're really not looking at buying lots of expensive gear to fix something that ultimately will only mean our animals grow faster. But that being said, I know you guys are super interested, and if you tested and got a value that looked way out of range, we're gonna let you guys know how to fix it. So first off, what do you do if the pH is testing too high? Well, I'll tell you guys, if yours is just testing a little bit high, so in other words, if you think of the ideal reef tank pH as 7.8 to 8.4 and you get an 8.5 or 8.6, I wouldn't worry about anything. If anything, that super elevated pH is probably just really boosting the growth of your animals, and it shouldn't be a problem. Now, if I test and I get a reading of a pH higher than, let's say, higher than that, say a pH of 9 or 10, most likely some additive has been overdosed in the aquarium. It's probably a calcium or alkalinity additive, as many of these raise pH. So it means that you made a mistake. So if this is the case, probably the best thing to do is to do a water change and find out what mistake you made and don't make it again. It could mean that you have an automated dosing pump you programmed incorrectly to dose too much, or you simply poured in too much of something. But your pH should not elevate that much unless you made a mistake of some kind. The most important way that we use this elevated pH to indicate a mistake is if you guys have a controller like a Neptune Systems Apex or Coral View Hydros, and it all of a sudden starts reading a really high pH, it can then buzz your phone, notify you that something bad has happened, where you can show up and try to fix it. And again, it usually means some piece of gear has malfunctioned. In this case, we don't have any of that fancy gear. We got the budget tank. We really should not see an elevated pH unless I made a mistake and dosed too much of our calcium and alkalinity supplements. That's pretty much the only time we should see it. What's probably more relevant to you guys is what do you do if your pH is too low, if it seems chronically too low, if you're getting that 7.8 constantly and maybe seeing into 7.6 or 7.5, which I have seen on some reef aquariums. Well, that means you have a depressed pH. And there's a few things that can cause it. Essentially with pH again, is if the pH is low, it means there's either too much acid or not enough base. And in most cases, it is too much acid. So my first recommendation, if you are getting constantly low pH readings in your reef tank, is to really clean everything out super well. And that's because a lot of organic molecules like rotting fish poop and uneaten food is acidic, has acids in it. A lot of organics have acids in it. So if there's a lot of organics in the water, that can depress the pH. In particular, the sand. I've had times where the pH in the aquarium tests chronically low, and I simply just vacuum out the sand really well, and it immediately goes up. It can make a bigger difference than you guys realize. So if you're getting chronically low pH, which can then slow the growth of your corals, start by just cleaning everything out super well. Number two is if you've cleaned everything out super well and you're still getting a depressed pH, the biggest factor in lowering pH in most circumstances is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is an acid, and this is why you might have heard people say, with increased CO2 levels, we have ocean acidification. That's because the CO2 is acting as an acid and acidifying oceans globally, but CO2 can really acidify the water inside of your aquarium. Now, where does CO2 come from? Well, it's going to come from the fish. The fish don't breathe air, they breathe in the water, but they're still using oxygen and exhaling CO2 into the water. So in particular, if you have an aquarium with a glass lid, it's going to trap all the CO2 the fish are respiring and putting out into the tank, and that can lead to it building up. So increasing ventilation will help to equalize the CO2 levels between the tank and the surrounding room. So if you have a glass lid on your tank, you could try removing it, swapping it for a mesh lid that ventilates better. You could try adding some cooling fans to blow under that lid. If you don't have a glass lid, you could try adding cooling fans again to increase the evaporation rate, which will help to equalize the CO2 levels between the water and the room. But that just equalizes them between the water and the room. And here's the thing, we live in the room, and when we breathe, we put out CO2. So if you have high CO2 levels in your room, it may not matter how well ventilated your aquarium is, how much gas exchange, because it's going to exchange that gas with the high CO2 in your room. This CO2 comes from just us breathing, could come from pets breathing, and just the fact that in modern homes, everything is sealed up, so there's very little fresh air. So how do you fix this problem? Well, if you've already gotten good ventilation in the aquarium by opening everything up and getting fans blowing across the surface and it's not making a difference, most likely it's that high CO2 in the room. And the best way to address that is to, if possible, open up windows, get fresh air into the room. That way you're getting outside air, not the CO2 built up in the sealed room of your house. Some people will go as far as to get the protein skimmer airline, run that airline outdoors, drill a small hole in their wall, run it outdoors, but it's bubbling fresh, non-CO2 laden air into the water. And another solution is to add a CO2 scrubber. This is a special device that is going to connect to your protein skimmer and suck the CO2 out before it's bubbled into the aquarium. And it has special media that is used to do that. Now, these solutions you might see are all kind of advanced. How many of us are going to open the windows on a frigid evening or a burning hot summer day just to increase the pH in our aquarium? How many of us are going to be drilling holes through the walls of our house to increase the pH of our aquarium? How many of us are going to want to buy another media reactor with dedicated media that we swap out once a month to boost the pH in our aquarium? And this is why we would consider it an advanced topic. Some other things you can do to boost your pH is you can switch your additives. So we mentioned earlier that some additives, when added to the aquarium, increase pH, some calcium and alkalinity additives. This would be things like kalkwasser. And other additives are going to decrease the pH of the aquarium when added, such as if you're using a calcium reactor. So you may decide, if your pH is low, to switch the type of additive you're using to supplement to one that boosts pH. But again, that's a pretty advanced topic, where for our beginner series, the idea of switching from a calcium reactor system to kalkwasser, or switching from this 1-part to a 2-part or a specialized 2-part, is a little bit more of an advanced topic. So that's how you address those pH low issues. Again, you want to increase ventilation in the room, or look into some of those advanced solutions like a CO2 scrubber, drilling holes through your wall to get better ventilation, or switching out the additives in your tank. Hopefully that gave you guys a great overview of what is pH, how do we test it, and how do you fix pH up or pH down problems. If you like this video, then like and subscribe for more. There should be plenty more content coming your way.